broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
This webinar will begin shortly. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Today we are joined by Fran O'Hara with 7 Deadly Sins of Scrum. Fran is the last webinar in our Eurostar 2018 Programme Launch webinar series. All recordings of these webinars will be available over on our Huddle site. We have our ebook ready for download. It is Python Scripting Essentials, and that can be found on the Huddle site. If you would like to ask Fran a question at any time during the webinar, please leave your question for him in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will allocate 10 to 15 minutes at the very end of this webinar to ask Fran your questions. So I will hand the floor over to Fran.
Right, thanks a lot, Cleona.
Thanks, Fran.
Okay, let me just get this going. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, I assume you can. Okay, 1 second. Let me just. Yeah, there we go. Apologies.
Perfect.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks a lot for signing up. Yeah, my name is Fran O'Hara. I've over 30 years experience, and the last 10, 12 have been in Agile mainly. So I've had a strong focus on test side and also then on Agile and Scrum and helping organizations implement Agile and Scrum and Kanban and those types of approaches. So the title of this talk is the 7 Deadly Sins. Just a couple of disclaimers, first of all. There are, of course, more than 7 sins that I've observed in organizations. These are the ones that I've experienced that I think are obviously key and obviously and also have maybe a particular relevance from a test and quality perspective as well. So just a quick recap, the first couple of slides, I'll just kind of recap on Scrum, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. You know, Scrum is the definition of it. It's a framework basically to address complex adaptive problems. It's not a process or a technique in itself. It's a framework within which you can employ various process techniques. So, for example, it says nothing about testing. It says nothing about technical practices. It's more about how to set up and run your teams, of course. So it is very simple. It's very lightweight, and I think that's why people like it. They kind of relate to it. But I guess that the problem is it's very difficult to master because it's about a mindset change. It's about agility, and that is often a big shift in people's thinking. So that's, I guess, where this webinar is coming from, just to talk about some of those difficulties that people have trying to actually implement this. The name comes from rugby. All the guys in the scrum working together to push that ball up the field and achieve a common goal. And in the same sense as we have a scrum team trying to achieve their goal. Here's the simple visual, just as a recap for you guys. The product backlog, which is constantly refined, which represents our requirements, the work we have to do. And then we run a series of sprints, as many as needed, to plan. We plan each sprint then, taking some of the key items, high priority items from the product backlog, and identifying the tasks we need to do to create our sprint backlog, which is basically our to-do list. And then we spend our sprint, whether it's 1 week or 3 weeks, whatever we have, trying to actually implement that. And we meet every day on daily scrum or stand-up to plan our day's work and self-organize as a cross-functional team. And then at the end, we have our product owner review what we've done, and other stakeholders that the product owner may invite. And at the end of that sprint, then we have an increment of working software. So the ideal is that we have software that's potentially releasable. So the only thing that's stopping being released is the product owner agreeing that it makes business sense to actually release it. From an engineering, from a test perspective, it's actually done. Now, I've heard anecdotally the figures of around maybe only 20% of organizations using Scrum are actually at that point. Most organizations have more I's to dot and T's to cross. One of the examples, for example, being certain non-functional or large-scale tests that haven't been able to be implemented in an incremental basis within sprints, for example. So a lot of organizations aren't fully there in terms of a potentially releasable increment in their implementation of Scrum. And then we do a retro, sprint retrospective to see on the process in terms of how can we improve things, and also tested would be a part of that as well. So they're the various bits of terminology within the framework. We have the roles, the product owner representing the customer, a Scrum Master managing the process, not managing the team because the team self-managed. The development team is made up of whatever competencies we need to produce that working increment of potentially releasable software. And of that, test is a strong competency that's going to be required. We have the various events I just went through there, the sprint planning, the review, the retro, the daily meeting, and the backlog refinement, which isn't articulated as a specific timed event within a Scrum, but it's look ahead work, getting the backlog ready for the next sprint at least, so that we have enough in the backlog to feed the next sprint at least, and ideally a bit more. So as required, meetings are organized to refine that backlog between the team and the product owner, facilitated by the Scrum Master. And then we have our artifacts, the product backlog, sprint backlog. And then what we need to do in Scrum is estimate remaining work. There isn't a focus on tracking actuals. The focus is on estimating remaining. And burn downs are just one way to do that. They're a common way to do that. And then there's a key artifact there from a test perspective, which is the definition of done. Because a number of the elements within that definition of done relate to testing and coverage. What is enough quality in our context, based on our risk appetite and our customers and so on. So that's the Scrum framework in a nutshell. In terms, why am I talking about Scrum? Well, it's pervasive. These are some results from the latest version 1 survey that came out a few days ago. And it obviously has its biases like any survey, but it gives us a view. At least I think there was about 1,500 respondents to this one, made up mainly of North America and Europe. And of those respondents, I think 98% or something were using Agile. And of those, 70% were using Scrum or Scrum hybrids. The hybrids being like Scrum Ban and Scrum with XP and so on. So it really is the framework that's being used predominantly. Now, maybe obviously in combination, and Kanban is getting more popular, but it's the dominant framework out there. So, given that it's been around for a long time, are we not there already? Well, I think that the point is that almost half of the respondents said that less than half of the teams in their organization were actually practicing Agile. We're not practicing Agile. So, in terms of driving Agile across the organization, there's still a long way to go. And then of all of those respondents as well, in the survey, 84% of them said their organization was currently at or below a still maturing level. So there's still a lot of work to go in terms of the depth of implementation of their Agile approach, and 70% of them using Scrum or Scrum hybrids. So that's, I guess, why it's still totally relevant to be talking about Scrum and so on. Obviously, there's DevOps. I think 70% in that survey were planning or currently had a DevOps initiative. And again, that's not at the exclusion of Scrum. It can be combined with Scrum. There's even a paper on scrum.org on that as well. And the fact that Scrum does not exclude continuous and continuous delivery. So in terms of this survey as well, finally, the challenges that the people in the survey reported on, culture and resistance to change, people type issues were the top two, and also then management support and so on. And that kind of very much aligns with what I have as the very first sin that I want to talk about, which is culture. And I think the sin here is not realizing the importance of people and culture and behavior and values, and thinking that Scrum is just a set of mechanical items to put in place and to do a meeting and to have this role definition and so on. It's a lot more than that. And because really it harks back to Agile and the Agile Manifesto and an Agile way of thinking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as the key, one of the key sins that I observed that actually impacts then on the benefits of Scrum, including quality and achieving the level of quality that you want to achieve. And then these are some of the other sins. I'm going to talk about a pull system that Scrum is meant to be and how that can be broken. Some planning sins, the backlog refinement. And again, there's a test slant on each of these as much as possible. Things that would impact on the test and quality is the focus. So I'll come to each of these: definition of done, backlog, and the Scrum Master. So the very first one then. Culture, people, mindset. I think this little cartoon kind of shows the issue here. It was really hard, basically, to change your organizational culture. So the biggest sin is not in the mechanics of Scrum itself, but in this wider context. But culture can relate to your own team and your own team behaviors, and it can relate to how you interact with other teams, and it can relate right across the organization at all levels then as well. Because agility, is a mindset, as I mentioned. So what's the problem? Basically, to get the benefits of Agile and Scrum, including those that are quality related, we really need to embrace this focus on culture and people. The Agile Manifesto is about people and culture. Largely, it's about individuals and interactions. It's about collaboration with customers. It's about embracing change and having that behavior that doesn't resist it, but sets herself up to embrace it, those types of behaviors. And changing this is hard. People do tend to resist change. And an example would be, for example, we're used to plan-driven approaches where we put a plan together and we follow a plan, and we like the certainty that a plan, or the illusion of certainty that a detailed plan gives us, and the commitment that we can demand against that plan and so on. And agility is about responding to change. It's about having a value focus. It doesn't mean we don't plan, but it means that we take empirical approaches like Scrum, whereby we're using experience to make decisions. We're using observations and data. We're learning by doing. We're not making plans at the front, big heavy for plans at the front when we know least. And similarly with requirements, we're not locking ourselves in to detailed baseline requirements with a resistance to changing those. So these are some of the key issues. So these cultural behaviors, these beliefs, these values, we need to introduce them, support them, reinforce them for an effective transition. And that kind of relate to you as a tester, if you're a tester on an Agile team, and the behaviors within your team and how you interact with others within that team, and how that team gels from a self-organizing point of view. Right through to the highest level within the organization. So that's why I'm talking about it here. It's not so you can influence this. You can do your bit regardless of where you are in the organization and what your role is. And being aware of it, I think, is really important. So how do we achieve the cultural change? Well, ideally, we want to align all these stakeholders from top down to bottom up. If we just have a bottom-up change, a bottom-up agile initiative, it's less likely to be successful. Similarly, if it's only top-down, if it's another management initiative that is viewed very skeptically. Ideally, we want to align. When we're going to be more likely to be successful, put it that way, if we can align the various levels within the organization. It isn't going to happen overnight, and that's why I've put in the phrase incrementally there. It really is a case of bit by bit. We try and put this in place, and we try and align these various levels within the organization up, and also the various stakeholders. And when I talk about stakeholders here, obviously there's the stakeholders within your team, the different roles, but also then different functions within your organization. Whether it's your finance and going towards incremental budgeting rather than the annual budgeting cycles to support a more agile way of working, whether it's HR, recruiting the right people, changing the performance review system to include a team element, providing agile related training, those kind of things. The customer is a key one, of course. It can be one of the key failure points in relation to agile, that the customer or be it product management within your organization as your internal embodiment of that, or whatever your business sponsors are. They don't become, if they're not engaged, then they're going to have lots of problems with your requirements, the prioritization, the incremental validation. All those things are going to be impacted. So the more you can start identifying where the biggest blockers are in relation to these different stakeholders, and start to tackle them and bring them on board and reinforce and educate, the more likely you're going to start getting the benefits from an agile point of view. So how do you do that? How do you align these stakeholders? Well, I think one of the key things is this first quote here. I think it's a great quote. I'll let you have a look at it there, but really it's about, again, it's back to people and how you approach change, and so leaders and managers being very clear about what this is about and how it's going to affect people and their roles, and also what the benefits are going to be to them and to the organization. So we want to build that trust. We want to remove fear and doubt, because it's that causes resistance. So I think that's a kind of a key point from a people point of view. And then the other one is basically to keep checking how you're doing, and to change it and to improve it and to address those obstacles. So in other words, applying and inspect and adapt approach to your change. Rather than saying we're going to adopt this change en masse in one big bang approach. So we constantly need to improve, and that's one of the purposes of the retrospective, is to constantly, continuously improve within the teams and outside teams. And the role of Scrum Masters in Scrum is not just inward looking to the team, it's also external and working with other Scrum Masters to help adopt a greater level of agility within the organization. So right down to, if you're working in a team, in an agile team, in a Scrum team, it's down to your behavior, it's down to your team's behavior. Again, this is about individuals and interactions over process and tools. Not that we don't have process, that we don't have tools, but we emphasize the individuals and interactions. And so Scrum advocates a cross-functional team. And so is your team's cross-functional? Does it have all the competencies that are required? That version 1 survey quotes that 48% of the respondents had not integrated development and testing. So therefore testing was still an independent function sitting outside the team, like a traditional approach, which again is a it's not Scrum, because Scrum is about having a cross-functional team, representatives from those different competencies in your team, so that your team has all the competencies it needs within itself to produce working software, produce that increment of potentially releasable software. So it's partly about team formation, and it's partly about the behavior of that team. Do you work with your other members of your team to have a whole team thinking approach, or do you have demarcation lines and sub-teams within your team? So again, it's about trying to bring that way of thinking into your whole team. So we're all working together. If somebody's blocked, we help them out, regardless of what particular activity that is. As long as we can help, we don't say that's not my job. So again, it's that kind of behavior. And then self-organizing. We don't have a project manager telling us what to do. We are a self-organizing team. We do our own estimation, we do our own planning, we make our own, we provide our own focus and commitment. And there's trust in us to do that, but then we deliver. We focus and deliver on that. That's what commitment means. It means that you focus within a team to achieve the goals of those sprints and provide for the needs of the product owner representing your customer. So specifically from a test point of view within those teams, let me just look at the time. Yeah, specifically from a test point of view, do we need dedicated testers in agile teams? Do they have to be technical and so on? Well, I think that's a question that often comes up, but it really depends. I've seen a whole spread of approaches that some that work and some that don't. But so there's no right answer to the question, because it depends on your context. It depends on the appetite for risk, for example. If there's not much appetite for risk and you want to have a high level of quality, then you're going to emphasize quality and probably do more testing and need more test competence, and it typically requires to have more professional testers involved, so you get that competency rather than it being an add-on activity that somebody competent in a different area takes on. But at the same time, it's not a requirement. It's not a requirement in Scrum, for example. Scrum just says cross-functional team with all the competencies. So if you have sufficient test competency for your context, within your team without having dedicated testers, that's fine as well from a Scrum perspective. So it really is, looking at your situation. And I was at a DevOps talk yesterday, for example. And in their particular approach, they're using Scrum, and they have 3 developers to 1 DevOps guy. But their DevOps guy is nominated as their test and infrastructure guy. So they have test skills, they're trained in testing and in test automation. But they have infrastructure skills and infrastructure as code and so on. So that's their area that they focus on. So, that's a particular example of a model where you don't have specific dedicated testers, but it suits that particular situation, whereas it may be totally inappropriate in other situations. So, I think you have to look and see what works in your context, really. I would, though, beware of previous versions of Scrum or the Scrum Guide, which used to talk about you have a product owner, you have a Scrum Master, and you have a development team. And the development team, everybody is called a Scrum developer. The intent of this was to ensure that we don't have sub-teams, that everybody is just working together as part of a whole team. And we'll call everybody the same thing, rather than having the DBA guys over there, or the architects over there, or the testers over there. Unfortunately, though, some people interpreted that as, well, you don't need testers, you just need developers in Scrum, and and I've even seen organizations fire their testers as a result of that. That wasn't the intent of that terminology, and in fact, in the latest version of the Scrum Guide from scrum.org, it's changed, and everybody is referred to as a team member. So again, that's just a bit of terminology to be careful of in your organization. Okay, so let me get on to some of these other sins then. There's a sin of push versus pull. Now, what do I mean there? I mean that the Scrum is intended to be a pull system, just like Kanban. It doesn't explicitly require it as such. It implicitly requires it, because what it means is that at the start of a sprint, it's the development team who decide on what scope they can take into that sprint, that they can pull into that sprint. So it implicitly limits work in progress by having sprints whereby it's a development team decision about how much scope to pull in from the product backlog to achieve a goal. And they make that decision, obviously, within the team. All the members of the team make that decision based on, it's an empirical approach. So they're using their past experience about how much they've been able to do in previous sprints and what they've achieved and got done and not got done. And also then looking at this particular sprint. And, is everybody there? Anybody on holidays? All that kind of stuff. So they make that decision, they pull it in. It's not a push system. A push system is something that I see quite a lot as an example of a sin. So you have product owners or other roles that are putting pressure for more to be done in the sprints, and the decision ends up not being made by the development team, and it moves from being a pull system to a push system, and that creates all sorts of problems. Basically, it means that we start up not doing, not seeing our own definite or and it's not as clearly should be less openness, and causes a lot of problems from starts to reduce done because of the fact that we have this context, push context rather than pull. So I think it's an important thing to understand around Scrum, in that it's a pull system, not a push system. So the Scrum Master needs to educate the product owner on this, and also on the team, so that everybody understands how it works. Yeah. Sorry about the cartoon here. It's supposed to refer to a guy basically who's supposed to pull the cord. Bad things happen if he just keeps pushing. Okay, so that's the second sin of push versus pull. It's interesting, actually, just recently as well. Scrum.org have released a guide on using Kanban with Scrum. And Kanban obviously explicitly limits work in progress. It's a pull system, very explicitly so. So it's interesting that you can start to bring in some of those flow-based concepts into Scrum, as opposed to seeing that you have to use make a decision between Scrum versus Kanban, for example. Combining obviously Kanban with the elements of Scrum is obviously increasingly like Scrumban is obviously a way to achieve that as well, in terms of moving towards a more flow-based approach as well. Okay, so moving on to third sin, planning. Here I've made a few points around planning, a few sins around planning. Like the first myth, of course, is that we don't plan in Agile and Scrum. We do lots of planning. We just don't produce heavy, detailed plans. We have lightweight, adaptive approaches, empirical. So we're value focused rather than plan driven. So if you look at the different levels of planning, there's a lot of sins that occur here. First of all, at the daily planning, what is daily planning? That's the daily stand-up, the daily Scrum. And one of the sins I see quite frequently is that there are other kind of particularly management types there, and it becomes a status reporting session. The objective of the meeting gets thwarted by the people who attend, who are not part of the development team. What its purpose is a self-organizing opportunity for the team to plan their day's work. And address and highlight and address highlight the impediments which can be addressed after the meeting, so that their day's work is the most productive as possible. There was a lot of confusion around who should attend, and there was a lot of reference back to the pigs and the chickens cartoon, if you've ever come across that one. But the latest version of the Scrum Guide kind of clarifies that other people may attend apart from the development team, but they cannot influence the objective of the session. So a manager participating in a daily Scrum who influences the behavior of the team so that they end up not doing effective planning of their day's work, that's a problem, and that needs to be addressed by the Scrum Master. However, if the team are quite happy and it doesn't affect them and they can do their day's work, the planning of their day's work, then not an issue. But it's one to be careful of that I've seen in practice. Sprint planning. One of the points about sprint planning is that it's more than just planning. It's actually joint design. So there's two parts to it. We decide what we want to take in, what we want to do, the PBIs, the product backlog items, usually in the form of stories. And then we figure out how we're going to do it, how we're going to implement it. So that involves jointly kind of designing the solution to these stories and identifying the tasks then that are required to implement that solution, design, code, test, and so on. Testers need to be involved in that, in particular because some of the tasks will relate to testing tasks and so on, and planning those and estimating that so that they're not underestimated, so that certain types of tests are not omitted, but also so that design considers testability. Because from the big focus on from the automation perspective is to focus from a let's say a test perspective, the lower levels of automation, but in particular areas like API level automation. And so we need to design with that in mind and have a product architecture that actually supports that API level test automation. And so, having test engagement there, again, one of the sins is that sometimes not everybody is there, and in particular, maybe tests don't, participate in this joint design session, because it's a very powerful thing. At the higher level then, a couple of sins relate to, like, release planning is an activity that's done a lot with Scrum. It's not part of pure Scrum. If you look at a Scrum guide, there is no concept of a release plan. What there is a concept of is empirical forecasting. So using past experience to forecast how long it's going to take us, how many sprints, for example, to get through a certain scope, or how many sprints will be required to actually achieve a certain scope. So that's the approach that Scrum advocates, because it's empirical. Therefore, there is no long-term detailed plan. And so release planning you have to be careful with. If it's light and adaptive, it's just effectively another word for an empirical forecast. But one of the problems with calling it a plan, like a release plan, is that a lot of stakeholders are still in plan-driven mentality. So they'll take that as something like it's cast in concrete, and so you really have to be careful with that, not only just the terminology as much as anything there. So we need them to be light and adaptive. And from a test perspective, again, when we stop producing artifacts, one of the consequences of it is that we stop doing the activity. So we no longer write big, large master test plans based on IEEE 829. However, what's happened a lot is that people have stopped doing test planning. Now, we are not going to schedule testing separately because it's no longer a separate activity. It's identified and estimated and planned for by the team in sprint planning. However, the heart of the test plan was the test approach, figuring out, based on this kind of work we're going to be doing, this kind of product we're going to be developing, these kind of features that are coming down the line, what kind of risks there are, and therefore what approach we need to take to our testing, what our automation strategy is going to be, what role exploratory is going to play. So this kind of still needs thought. And even if it's only on a whiteboard, we still need to, agree what our test approach is. Keep it light, but also keep it adaptive. Keep changing it and improving it based on our experience of the testing that we're doing and the results that we're getting. So it's an activity that I've seen often fall into disuse. The lack of that high-level thinking and adaptation of that thinking as we progress through our sprints. In terms of the right approach or strategy to be taking. Yeah. And then finally, our general common problem is not having that highest level, that big picture vision of where we're going here, because we tend then to get blinkered by stories rather than seeing the big picture. And from a testing perspective, having a test approach that also looks at that big picture. Moving then on to the next thing, backlog refinement. So the thing here is not having valuable product backlog items that are ready for the next sprint. So sometimes that results from insufficient involvement and collaboration, potentially sometimes of the test side. So it really has to be about teamwork. It's not just the product owner in isolation defining these things and handing them over. It's not about your main technical guy working with the product owner to define them and handing them over to other people. It's about everybody collaborating, working together, so we have a shared understanding of those requirements. Like user stories are just a communication tool. They're really forcing us to talk. They're a collaboration tool. And it gives us something to talk around. And the three amigos, for example, is a practice that's used in behavior-driven development. And the three amigos are your business representative, your development representative, and your test representative. And it emphasizes the importance of having that test perspective in those conversations. And that's typically implemented simply as the whole team with those different perspectives in that team working together to define those requirements. And another element of backlog refinement, sin I sometimes see is just not meeting having good enough PBIs, good enough product backlog items that meet criteria like the invest criteria, so that the items are independent, they're negotiable, they have some business value, we can estimate them all, and of course then they're testable. We've always need to be able to test requirements. So this, Agile is no different. So we need to ensure that they're testable. And the small element is one that has a big impact on test as well. If the stories are too big, if the product backlog items are too big, we end up only being able then to take a small number of them into a sprint, 2 or 3 or even 4. And what ends up happening then is that, most of those stories then end up being completed towards the end of the sprint because they're so large, or being ready rather for test execution towards the end of a sprint because they're so large that a lot of work has to go into design and implementation of those, and before execution of tests, be it manual or automated, starts taking place. And as a result, we start finding most of the defects towards the end of a sprint. So what have we got? We've got a mini waterfall. The mini waterfall is not Agile. Agile is about integrating testing throughout that whole life cycle. So we need to start with a test-first approach. We need to have small stories that get completed along the way throughout that sprint. So there is no phase or stage of testing at the end of a sprint. And again, that's a very common problem. The problem of mini waterfalls that causes then the traditional squeeze on testing at the end, because we're trying to get everything done to meet the goal of that sprint as much as possible. Then we have definition of done. There's quite a lot of sins here, and they're very test related as well. Like testing is a key part, and the coverage we want to achieve in the software with our testing is a key part of being done. What types of testing, what level of coverage, and so on. Defects, what we're saying about defects and what's acceptable being done from that perspective. What is a defect? What does no defects mean if that's our definition of done? So not having a definition, I've seen that. Not following it under pressure in particular, that's quite a common sin. It just being weak. Yeah, and not including sufficient coverage elements or sufficient test elements within it. Being clear about its scope. Is it just our team, or should we be sharing one with other teams because we're both working on the same product? Or is there some organizational standard we should be following in relation to it and augmenting as we see fit? And then typically there's 2 levels defined in Scrum. There's done for a product backlog item like a story. So what are the items that we need to have in place for that item to be done? And then additionally, what would we need to do in relation to being done with the increment, which would include, say, regression testing as well. So they're the 2 levels of done that are defined within Scrum. Now, people often in practice, because their increment isn't potentially releasable, they typically have a 3rd level. So these are all the I's they have to dot and T's they have to cross to actually be able to release that software. And again, one of the things in your Agile journey that you're trying to achieve is to incorporate more of those items from your release level definition of done into the sprint, into the increment definition or the PBI definition of done. Over time, gradually, bit by bit. Take performance testing, for example. It may end up being something we do once right at the end now on a large-scale load test, but we want to start doing elements of that and baselining and so on, and profiling along the way within the sprint. In our sprints, rather than leaving it evolving our definition of done. So it just becomes a static thing. We constantly should be reviewing this because it's a great tool to manage technical debt, for example. If we're injecting too much technical debt, we're not doing a good enough engineering job because our definition of done is weak. There's too many bugs in there, our test coverage is poor, our automation coverage is poor, those kind of things. Technical debt is increasing the whole time. The definition of done is our tool to get the balance right, so that we don't want zero technical debt, we want manageable technical debt. And the tool to kind of manage that is the definition of done. So we need to constantly review it in our retrospectives and see, is it good enough? Is it too heavy? Is it too light? What's our level of technical debt? Are we happy with it? And so on and so on. So it's a key item to be discussed pretty regularly at retrospectives. And it should evolve, and as you get better and more mature and have better approaches to getting required level of quality, the definition of done should evolve. And again, it's about taking that long-term view rather than getting that thing out the door at all costs. The definition of done is helping ensure that the total cost of ownership of that software is appropriate, and we're not going to be stuck maintaining that for the next 10 years with heavy maintenance costs. The sprint backlog, a couple of items here. Not having explicit estimated test tasks in the first place, they're not actually visual on the board. They don't include, let's say, early test activities, and in fact, defect prevention is a big focus with the collaboration of test, so that we have a better understanding of requirements and so on, and prevent defects in the first place. Test-driven approaches, acceptance level test-driven, whether it's ideally automated, but even if it's not, defining those tests up front will help clarify the requirements, because tests are requirements. They're models of required behavior. So having test case definitions up front, doing the implementation later, whether it's manual or automated, but having the test case definition up front is a valuable thing that you want to see in a sprint backlog. As one of the first tasks that should be taken in progress is to find the test cases for that PBI. Another thing you see sometimes is that all the tests just relate to the stories. There's no big picture testing. There's no, well, how do these stories interact, and testing that? What about the overall feature, the non-functional elements, and so on? And then obviously having items in it that ensure our definition of done is going to be met. Another thing I see as a sin is the separation of test. You know, I think what I said there, 48% of the from the survey had integrated test and dev. So therefore, you're going to have this kind of picture. You're going to have a test column, to verify column. And to me, it's a simple visual that shows that we don't have a cross-functional team that's self-organizing with whole team thinking. We have this separation of development and test, and that's highlighted as a separate column sometimes on the board, where test really, if you're doing Scrum and you've got your to-do in progress, and you're not using a flow-based approach, basically test is just another task like any other task that you take to the in progress column. Not estimating and visualizing, debug and retest. That relates to the fact that, you know, we need to account for the fact that we're going to find bugs and they're going to have to be fixed and retested. So there's an estimation thing we need to account for in our sprint planning. And then the other thing, of course, we need to do is visualize it when it happens. So a common way to do that, or a good way to do I've seen, is basically put a blocker on the task, whether it's testing or whatever, that's found the defect, and then throw up a new task to actually go and fix it. But the two things we need to do, however we decide to solve that problem, are to account for defects and the fixing and retesting of defects in our estimation, and then to visualize it as it happens. Yeah. So again, sins that we maybe sometimes don't do that well. And then finally, the Scrum Master. You could argue that, I guess, all of the previous sins I've talked about, the Scrum Master has a particular responsibility, or most of them anyway, would have a responsibility to at least help identify and alleviate those sins. Whether it's cultural issues, I think that's a key point. Not just focusing on the mechanics of Scrum, but focusing on those behaviors in terms of self-organization is one of the hardest ones. And I think it's one of the hardest jobs of a Scrum Master, is to coach a team into self-organization when they haven't been kind of used to that. It's a new thing for them. So that can be a difficult behavior for teams to exhibit and for people to start to take on board. So coaching the team into that behavior and reinforcing that and encouraging that is a key role of the Scrum Master, rather than just facilitating meetings. It's a lot more than that. And sometimes they are ex-leads or ex-managers who find it difficult to stop managing people. Servant leadership is the phrase that's often used rather than management in terms of that role, obviously, because they're managing the process, but they're not managing the people. So it is a management role. They have authority to remove impediments and to support the organizational transition to agile and greater levels of agility. But they don't manage the team. They're a self-organizing team. Sometimes it's one of the sins I see, they're part-time. So they're also maybe a technical member of that team. And what happens then is that they often get sucked into the technical work and don't focus sufficiently on that Scrum Master role, or they're spread across two teams. And in the early days, in particular, when a team is a low level of maturity from an agile perspective, it is a full-time role for that team. Over time, as the team matures, then I'd suggest it could be something that you could look at in terms of is it possible to reduce it down, or for a Scrum Master to play an increasingly wider role outside the team, whatever that may be. Not harnessing the power of retrospectives. I quite often see retrospectives maybe not being performed very well. And again, it's a key meeting for the Scrum Master. It's the only meeting where they play an active participant role. Having too much of a team focus and not having this additional organizational focus, and obviously seeing those other sins, as I talked about. So hopefully that's given a few practical insights into some of the pitfalls and things that go wrong with Scrum. Hopefully you can avoid them, or maybe become a bit more aware about how they could be addressed based on those points I've gone through. But please, if you haven't already done so, maybe add any kind of comments, share your sins, any questions. So I'll hand back to Cleona.
Thank you, Fran. Great presentation. And yes, as Fran said, there is still time to ask Fran your questions. I know we have a few in already, but you can still ask questions there for Fran, and I will read them out soon. 3 webinars left to register for up on our content calendar. We have a DevOps webinar, an automation webinar, and an agile webinar. You can still avail of our group discount, which will be available until next Wednesday. So that's buy 3 tickets and get 2 free. So, Fran, questions. Can we have a separate product owner and a Scrum Master? Separate product owner and a separate Scrum Master?
Typically, they are 2 separate roles, very much so. I think that there's almost not a conflict of interest, but there's certainly very different areas of focus. Like the product owner, their focus is on maximizing the value from the team and optimizing that value by helping to represent the view of the customer and helping to prioritize what the team work on and accept what the team work on. So their focus is the product. Yeah, and it's a very, very different focus to be focused on the process in terms of the way the team are going to work and supporting the team and coaching the team and the behaviors as well from a cultural perspective that you want to achieve with greater levels of agility. So, it's more common for a Scrum Master to be part of the development team to have some responsibilities within the development team. I'm saying it's common. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. I think the Scrum Master is a full-time role, particularly in the early stages. I don't often see Scrum Master and Product Owner in the same. Very rarely would I see that, because they're two totally different areas of focus. And you'd question whether somebody playing both roles is able to give sufficient focus to those two areas as well. So I'd certainly suggest that you keep them separate.
Okay. Who are the people to influence when trying to transition to Scrum and Agile? It's a two-part question. Should we gain buy-in from senior management teams who may be stuck in old traditional ways of thinking?
So sorry, the first part there was about,
who are the people
who
to
should we try and influence?
Yes.
Yeah, like on the first part, it's like that slide I showed there earlier on about the lining everything up. And to be honest, you've got to look at your organization and go, where is the big right now to us achieving greater levels of agility? And it can be in the practitioner competency areas. It can be the DBA guys don't want to get involved, or it can be test and dev not talking to each other and showing things over the wall to each other. It can be in those, but it can also be with different levels within your organization. Management, it's often a key one to influence, because there is no role for project in Scrum. So straight away, if I'm a project manager, I'm worried, what am I going to do as we go more agile? What's my... Their fear comes in, like that resistance comes in, and then they become blockers, and then they don't support, they don't encourage, they don't make the changes that are needed to actually support moving from a plan-driven approach to a value-driven approach. And obviously, senior man should be looking at the overall, looking at what kind of central give to the teams that maybe is very difficult for themselves to put in place. An example would be the infrastructure, would be continuous integration. So in terms of who to influence, well, it depends on who you are and where you're at. Ideally, you're trying to influence all those levels so that you bring people on board with you. And at any point in time, you've got to look at, well, where is the biggest, tackle that bit by bit, inspect it. The second part, what was that again?
Should we gain buy-in from senior management teams who may be stuck in old traditional ways of thinking?
Obviously, senior management, there's an educational thing to be done there to understand, what is leadership about, and what kind of way are modern organizations working, and focusing on more agile lean approach. And so there's an educational thing there to be done, so that they're aware of let's say, their responsibilities. In some cases, they need to be driving it. In other cases, they just need to not be an obstacle to it. So they need to ideally supported, but minimum they to not be blocking it. So to do that, they need to understand it. So there's an educational thing to be done there as well in the first place, for whatever extra level maybe don't get it or are resisting at a certain point in time.
Okay. Can a tester be a Scrum Master in the same team, or is the Scrum Master an exclusive role?
Well, I suggest it's a full-time role. It's an exclusive role, particularly in the early days. Okay. Now, the trouble is that when people look at the Scrum Master role, they go, that's not a full-time job. What would you have one person doing full-time for? Like, in terms of who should play that role, I think it's more of a personality profile. You need to have, obviously, a good understanding of Scrum and process and people. Now, that can come from any area. That can come from tests. That can come from development. It can come from any particular area of competence. The issue is, does the person have the skills to do the job? And in terms of it being a full-time role, then it's got to do with, if you look at the responsibilities of the Scrum Master, and particularly ones around helping with the cultural change in terms of self-organizing teams and helping coaching the team into self-organization, on top of all of the coaching on the mechanics of Scrum. And if you also look at the role relating to helping with the organizational transition to Scrum and agility, there's an awful, there's a lot of work there, supporting the team, removing the impediments that the team are having on a sprint to sprint basis, things that are coming out of the retrospective that the team can't solve themselves or need help in actually implementing. Supporting the team, creating those safe to fail experiments where they're continuously trying to try things out and try new things and improve. That to me, and in the first instance, actually developing your own skills as a Scrum Master so that you have a sufficient knowledge and understanding as well in relation to Scrum and Agile and other technical practices and what other teams are doing within your organization and how we can kind of, collaborate on improvement. So to me, it's a full-time role. Now, when your team achieves a high level of maturity, then then it certainly is something you could look at, and whether it's something that's full-time or not. But in the early days of adoption and in lower levels of maturity, it's certainly, in my view, a full-time role.
Okay. I think this question kind of follows on. How big should my Scrum team be?
Well, if you look at the Scrum guide, there's very clear rules if you want to be following Scrum as per its definition. And there's a Scrum Master, a product owner, that's 2 people, and then the team size is 3 to 9, anywhere between 3. So 3 is good, 9 is good, and anywhere in between. So if you have less than 3, in other words, you've only got 2 people working on implementing the software, do you need all the overhead of Scrum? Okay. If you have more than 9 people, it becomes pretty difficult and eventually impossible to actually coordinate and facilitate collaboration between that many people. I've seen teams try to run sprint planning sessions with 14 people and so on, and it just doesn't work. It's too difficult. You cannot achieve the objectives within the time boxes. The overhead then starts to go up. You spend less time actually doing the work, and it's just inefficient. Okay. So as a result, you should have 2 teams, split them, and then coordinate between those teams. If they're both working on the same product, they should work off a single product backlog, with the product owner deciding how to structure that so that they minimize dependencies between those teams, and so on. So there's very clear rules around the size.
Yeah, okay. How do I prioritize a backlog?
The product owner does it.
Okay.
Basically, the product owner uses whatever criteria they see fit. A common one is business value to cost ratio.
Okay.
So the items that have the highest business value, and you can put that on a numbered scale if you want as a product owner, 1 to 100, 1 to 10, whatever. And then the development team give it the cost. The only people who estimate are the development team. So in Backlog Refinement, they estimate the relative size of these items. One of the more common sizing techniques is story points. You can use t-shirt sizes, whatever you want, but story points is used quite a bit, with planning poker used to actually do the team-based estimation. So if I divide business value by the story points that the team have provided, as a product owner, I will get a relative ordering. Because prioritization doesn't mean high, medium, and low. Prioritization in Scrum means a forced ranking. It means ordered 1, 2, 3. So there's no point in the development team seeing 50 high priority items. They need to know what to pull in first. So the product owner has to give that ordering. However, they can use whatever criteria they see fit. They can use risk. They can decide to tackle the highest risk element first, or the lowest risk. They can decide to implement the bare bones of a workflow so that they can get some feedback from a key stakeholder on that workflow. So they can decide to prioritize some key features so that they'll be available for a demo at a trade fair. So it really is up to the product owner to use their business knowledge to decide what is the best approach to prioritization and creating an ordered list in the product backlog. supported by the development team, but accountability, the management of that product backlog is the product owners accountable.
Okay. When is Scrum not a methodology? When is Scrum not a methodology to use?
Yeah, this comes up quite a bit as a discussion point, and you know, as I mentioned briefly in there, some people say, well, DevOps is about continuous, so you can't use Scrum with continuous because you've got sprints, these fixed iterations, and there's very clearly that's not true, because there's organizations using Scrum and DevOps, and the increments being produced at the end of a sprint is an opportunity to get that business related feedback as you progress with your product development. If you, however, having continuous delivery, you can be you know, deploying your software multiple times a day if you want. That's no problem, and it's a really good thing to do, to be moving to that level of continuous delivery from a DevOps perspective. So, and similarly, you know, Kanban, as I mentioned, you know, sometimes people have looked at Scrum and have looked at Kanban as being these two competing things, but they can actually also be used together in combination. In terms of scenarios I can think of where it's more difficult to use Scrum, if you have a totally event-driven environment, interrupt-driven environment, it's very difficult to plan a sprint. However, you know, if I'm dealing with, let's say, support issues as part of my team's responsibility, then if that level of interrupt work, that's where I don't know tomorrow what I'm going to be doing, is relatively low, you know, 10, 20, 30%, if it doesn't vary wildly. In other words, if it doesn't impact on my ability to deliver on planned work as a team, then Scrum is still totally applicable. I can reserve a capacity for that unplanned work, and I can plan the sprint in the usual way. However, if all my work, or the vast majority of work, is very much in that mode of you can't plan it, then it's very difficult to use sprints. Okay. And therefore, Kanban in that situation would probably be something I'd advise to use instead, a flow-based approach rather than an iteration-based approach.
Okay. Should the daily Scrum be done first thing in the morning?
Doesn't matter. It's up to the team. You're just planning the next 24 hours. And when you decide to synchronize that, is up to you. Whatever works for you. You can have people in different time zones, distributed, syncing up together, whatever time works. Okay. But it should be the same time, same place, minimizing overhead.
Okay. Last question, Fran. What sin, in your opinion, is the most detrimental?
The most detrimental sin is the first one.
Okay.
Culture, people, behaviors, values. Definitely.
Okay. Great. Fran, thank you so much for joining us today, and we really appreciate you being part of this series. I know Scrum is always a popular topic with our audience, so we really do appreciate you being with us here today.
No problem. Thank you for the invite.
Thank you, Fran, and speak soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.